Yeah, and I think, oftentimes we look at contract agreements as being relatively brief, but I guess the time elements that we're in now dictate that we have a lot more verbiage in those contracts to cover that.
You are listening to Manager Brothers Lessons Learned. Twice each month, Gregg and Jae draw on their combined 80-plus years of state and local government work experience to help listeners avoid the pitfalls they and others have unwittingly stumbled into. And now, on to the episode.
Well, welcome to another episode of Manager Brothers Lessons Learned. This is Gregg Jae.
And this is Jae Jae.
The last episode, we talked about whether or not a manager should enter into a contract when hired by a municipality. And we came down on the side of, you probably should. And we said then we wanted to jump to the very end of contract, looking at how contracts come to a conclusion, severance compensation and those kinds of things. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. As we get started, what I wanted, and we have a lot of things that we're going to be covering in the 30 minutes or so that we're involved with this today. And so what I want to encourage our listeners to do is if we cover something too quickly, you want more information about it, or you think we've skipped over something that relates to contract termination kinds of issues or anything else related to contracts, write us. We have the easiest way to get in touch with us is to go to our business website, greggllc.com. That's GREGGLLC.com. Look for the Lessons tab, and you will find a contact form on there. You fill out the form, push the button, that ends up sending an email to us, and then we'll be able to respond on the air if that's appropriate, and so we'd really like to encourage that. But Jay, let's just jump in here and talk about the thing that increasingly ends up in contracts, and I think almost every manager contract these days has some form of severance compensation. And I don't know, I know that in my most recent contract, I've had that. I commented the last time I went through most of my career without a contract, so never had an opportunity to talk about severance pay before then. But what about you? Was that a common feature in contracts that you had?
No, I actually never had that in my contract. So the last assignment that I had, I was obviously still there when the council was going through the process of searching for my replacement. I'd given them sufficient notice, and we'll talk about that perhaps in a little bit here. But of course, I was working on some elements of what the municipality would want in the next contract, and talking with the village attorney regarding that. He was putting those elements together, and so I suggested that they have, a severance compensation in the contract. Mm-hmm. And I think that, was appropriate. And, had I had another contract, I would have insisted that they have some element of that in there. But so
why didn't you? Why didn't you when you went there?
I don't recall. I guess
you didn't ask your big brother whether you should.
I guess, and I didn't think it was necessary. I just thought, okay, I'm going to be here. My plan was this was going to be my last full-time stop. And so when the time came, I was going to give sufficient notice and exit. And so maybe this is where I should talk about that particular element in the agreement that I did have. Mm-hmm. There was the clause in there, and I guess we could talk about this as the escape clause, and it sounded like a Tim Allen movie, but anyway, there's no Santa involved in this one. But my contract took effect May 1st, and so in the contract was a provision that if I was planning on departing, that I provide notice no less than 90 days before my anniversary date. So effectively by the end of January, I would have had to provide notice. So just as a courtesy, each year that I was there, whatever the previous council meeting would have been to the end of January, I always provided notice that I'm planning on being here for another year, and council, for the most part, except for 1 year, I think, didn't react one way or the other. They just said, okay, fine, we just keep on going.
Right.
So, but I think that escape clause, as I'm calling it, is important not just for the manager but also for the municipality as well, because. Right. In my particular instance, since my departure was a planned departure, I provided notice in January of my last year and said, I'm planning on leaving, May 1st, and after all of the crying and everything else was over with, and they kind of accepted that I was serious about this, even though I had one council member that just begged me to stay for another 5 years, and I said, well, that's not going to happen. But anyway. So that was, so again, I think there needs to be some kind of it's like I say, calling it escape clause in the agreement that, states whether it's so many days before. Now, having said that, as we've talked before, we're at-will employees. How significant is any kind of an escape clause? I mean, even if in my particular instance we'd passed, gone past January 31st, does that mean I couldn't leave, or that council couldn't get rid of me? Well,
right.
Certainly not.
No, and the answer to both of those questions is no. They can, you can, and they can.
Right.
The escape clause notwithstanding, unless in many cases you'll have language in a contract that says you have to give a certain number of days notice prior to leaving. Those kinds of things, and I think those are reasonable. And we might want to cover some of those things a little bit more thoroughly as we get into other contract provisions in later episodes.
Yeah, and I think the other element that figures into this is whether you're leaving, of your own volition, or whether council is getting rid of you. So then you look at, is it with cause or without cause? And I think that's an important consideration, because certainly if a manager did something that was illegal, council might be inclined to get rid of them.
Well, and should.
Yeah,
and should.
Exactly, exactly.
That's exactly right. And I think that as we get into talking about severance pay here,
yes.
There are contracts will likely have provisions that will deny severance in an instance where the termination is a result is for cause.
Right.
And I specifically want to talk about that a little bit further as we go along here. But I think, Jay, kind of going back to your experience, I guess I would have counseled that despite having escape clause language in there, and my contracts always did as well, the last contract I had, mine was on a 2-year cycle, so I timed it that way on purpose. So you did have some of that advance notice. In your case, say 5 months before the expiration of the contract, you were expecting that council was going to say, once you gave them notice, they were going to say, no, we don't think so. If you gave them notice that you intended to renew the contract, they could come back and they could say, we don't really want to do that. So to kind of steer away from that for just a bit and then talk about the severance compensation for those of us that did incorporate that language in there, what is your thinking, Jay, about what's reasonable, and maybe for a first initial contract for a brand new manager, and then for a more experienced contract, how long, when you figure out the severance compensation, how long should that run for?
Well, and there was always that debate, I think, about, should you have severance compensation if the manager is the one that's choosing to leave? There was a
and that's a separate issue. Let's assume for talking purpose, and all right, let's cover that right off the bat. I don't think so. Now, there is a circumstance that I think is different, and we'll talk about that, I think, as we get a little bit later into the episode here. But I think one of the circumstances that, if a manager is just doing a career advancement, he's going on to take another job someplace else, and so he's giving his 30 days notice. I take a really dim view of managers who think that that ought to trigger off some kind of severance compensation for them, and yet I have seen that has happened. I think it smells bad. Now it's different. It's one thing, you should get compensated for unused paid time off, those kinds of things. But let me know what your thought is. But I don't like this. I don't like the smell of it. I don't like the way it looks.
Yeah, no, I think it's not ethical, but I have seen it as well.
So then let's talk about an involuntary termination, whether it is an actual firing or whether a manager is forced to resign, and that's going to trigger. And it's not for cause. We'll deal with that in a little bit. So let's say for a non-cause termination on the part of the council, what's your feeling about what managers should think about in terms of what's reasonable?
My first thought is it should be tied to the manager's tenure in that municipality. So basically, the longer your tenure, the greater the severance compensation period should be. That's my thoughts. Now, whether there should be a minimum, I don't know. And that's, maybe this is part of jumping back to talk about an escape clause again. If a municipality hires, makes a commitment to hire a manager, they're on board, but in a short period of time, it clearly becomes evident that it's not a good match. It wasn't related to an election or anything like that. It's just that it's just not a good match for the community. So the manager's being asked to leave or told to leave, in less than a year's time, let's say. I think there still should be a severance package, again, if it's not the manager's choice to do that. But, if you have such a short period of time, I think there should be some kind of severance. But how long a period of time, I guess, is up for debate. What other managers might think is appropriate.
In the old days, the general thought was that you needed to have enough severance pay to cover that period of time when you are going to be out there looking for a job. So if you lose, if I'm a manager and I lose my job tomorrow, it's likely that I'm going to be 4 or 5 or 6 months just getting a resume, identifying another job, getting my resumes out in the mail or in email these days, having gone through that process, the interview process, the whole hiring process. You're 4, 5, 6 months down the road. And so the logic of the severance pay for managers was, what's the source of income that's going to cover you during that period of time? And so generally, this has gotten longer over time, but generally, I think there's been a little bit of a standard to say 6 months, but I've seen managers with 9-month and 12-month severance compensation provisions in their contracts. However, going back to perhaps a brand new manager or a manager early in his or her tenure, I think you do sometimes see shorter periods of time for that. The thing that I think is concerning about that is that you don't want to have, in my view, one of the things that a severance package does is to discourage councils from taking hasty action. So if they're dissatisfied with the manager's performance and they're thinking, man, we're just going to toss this guy out the door. If you have a severance package that's only a couple of months or 3 months, there's not much of an economic or a financial disincentive for them to hold off on that. They may very well say, gee, this isn't going to cost us that much. We might as well boot him out the door. But so I think there's some variations there. One thing I want to mention too, when we talk about severance compensation, is it's not only the managers in their negotiating contracts should not only think in terms of the pay, the salary, but also continuation of insurance benefits, particularly health insurance benefits. I'm not personally, I'm not so sure about life insurance and some of the other kinds of things, but health and dental and vision, those are things that, if they're a part of the compensation package, I think the expectation is that those should continue on for a period of time as well. Now, here's one other thing, Jay, that I have seen that has cropped up in some manager contracts, and it's been for both benefits and for compensation, which is that it comes to an end and the manager gets another job, regardless of where that is. I think that's a little bit problematic. I don't know what your thinking about that is, but one of the concerns that I would have about that, and I can certainly understand with health insurance, once you've got health insurance with another employer, there's no reason for your past employer to necessarily keep you on the books for that and have to pay that premium. But with compensation, the whole idea that if I've lost my job as a manager, but I get hired as a greeter at Walmart, my severance pay comes to an end. I'm not sure that's in my benefit to do that. And to be more realistic, some managers are going to get hired in perhaps on a temporary basis as an interim. They might get hired as a department head or for a special project with a municipality. If those things all trigger off the end of severance pay, it's a disincentive for the manager in many cases to go and actually look for that kind of work, be out there and networking and doing those kinds of things to get that next long-term permanent job. So I would discourage provisions that allow for that, kind of easy cutoff when you get another job.
Yeah, I think there's some room for debate on that, and one of the things that I think is worth considering when you look at the our profession. Generally speaking, managers have moved up the ladder, I guess you want to say, as they gain more experience. They're going to go to larger municipalities or certainly wealthier municipalities or whatever that have more challenges and things like that. So not unlike the rest of the business world, CEOs go through periods of time if they change jobs. If they are used to running, a multi-billion-dollar corporation, they're not going to go looking for a job at Walmart, to use your example there. And I think the same thing is true with managers. If they have been managers in a large municipality, they're not necessarily going to take too many steps back towards smaller municipalities, just because they're looking at compensation and benefits and what have you in the way of challenges, I guess, that they're used to managing large number of employees, this type of thing. So the opportunities that may exist, even though they're making a bona fide effort to secure another manager position, there may not be as many positions out there in say a 90-day period of time, certainly, but even in a 12-month period of time. So you may need to look at may need to consider that that factor as well. That if you've worked for a lot of years and you've moved up the ladder into larger municipalities, you may want to opt for a much longer severance time frame.
Right, exactly. There's one other issue that I wanted to come back to, and that's talking about, as we talk about severance, and we alluded to this before, and that is what happens with severance if the manager is terminated for cause. And I think you had weighed in on this, and I think you and I share the same point of view that if the manager is terminated for cause, then there's probably good reason to suggest that they ought not to be paid severance pay for that, in that kind of a situation. However, here's the issue, and that is the contract should be clear in terms of what constitutes cause. And so if you just have a statement in there that says you're not going to get, we're not paying severance pay in the event of a termination for cause, and doesn't define what cause means, that's a real serious problem for the manager if they get to that kind of point. That point in time. I think that there should be an expectation that that's defined.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes we look at contract agreements as being relatively brief, but I guess the time elements that we're in now dictate that we have a lot more verbiage in those contracts to cover that.
We're going to take a break here for just a second, and then when we come back, I want to talk about the idea of separation agreements as you get to a contract termination. And so stick with us, and we'll be back in just a second to talk about that aspect.
We'll return to Manager Brothers Lessons Learned in a moment. Do you have a topic you would like Gregg and Jae to explore? Are you interested in being a guest on Lessons Learned? Do you have comments about this episode? You can write Gregg and Jae using the contact form at greggllc.com/lessons. That's greggllc.com/lessons.
Okay, we're back. One of the provisions that I had written into my one and only contract, and it had to do with my experience of being forced to resign. One of the consequences of my being one of the things that happened after I was forced to resign was that I ended up negotiating a separation agreement with the council at that time. And the result of my doing that led me to see that as a really sound way to end that relationship with the council. And because what it does is it puts the parties into a mode of thinking about how they end the relationship amicably, if that's possible to do that. And what it does is if the parties are aware that they have to sit down at the table and negotiate how you conduct the divorce, if you will, I think that it inclines parties to not be hasty and to think about all of those end of relationship kinds of issues that might get overlooked if you're not paying attention to it. And I think it's useful whether it is a voluntary termination or an involuntary termination, either somebody's being forced to resign or they're being fired. What that does is as I say, it spells out the terms on which the manager leaves employment. And I think that, well, I'm going to cover a few of those things that you might want to think about as you're getting to that. But I really want to encourage managers to think seriously about having a requirement that when that relationship comes to an end, when they are not going to renew the contract, that or when they're terminating it, or you've decided to leave that job, that you sit down at the table and hammer out the terms under which that relationship comes to an end, and any kind of carryover, any tail to that relationship. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. Jay, I don't know.
And I think that's an important point, because whether you're leaving of your own volition or council is asking or telling you to leave, I think that, I've done exit interviews, which is more of an informal thing than what you're talking about with a separation agreement, but I think there's some similarities there. And what I think is important for the elected officials is, if there have been some obstacles, either for the municipality or for the manager themselves, it's important to put those on the table and begin to address those in preparation for replacing the manager. Hiring a new manager. You don't want to whatever issues there are, mistakes have been made or something. You don't want to just perpetuate them with the next manager, because if you're going to run into those same obstacles again, how long is that manager going to want to stay?
Right.
So
right.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing to think about in terms of that separation agreement, and that is, let's say that you get the sense that your relationship with the council has turned sour, and you don't know how long it's going to work. I think many of us kind of get a bad feeling at times, thinking, I'm not sure this is where I'm going to be for a while, for much longer, or whatever it might be. the idea that you can go to, say, and I have done this, gone to the mayor and said, I don't think this is working very well. Why don't we sit down and think about negotiating an end to this relationship? And what that does is it then takes I think it takes a little bit of the pressure off both parties to sit down and be reasonable about how you get things done.
Right.
I want to talk about just a few of the things to think about that might go into a separation agreement. Obviously, you want to have your compensation, your severance pay, and any other compensation items. And by the way, if you're initiating it and they're in agreement that this is a relationship we want to end, you might be able to actually get more compensation just because you're handling it voluntarily. And
right.
So you're willing to walk out the door. You're willing to give them, give them a voluntary resignation so they don't have to go through the agony of having a vote and sometimes a split vote on the council. I think that if you sit down and that's really the way I handled it. The one time where this came up with the council, I said, and this is where I didn't have a contract, I said, look, if we can agree on a separation agreement, I'll submit my letter of resignation. They never voted to fire me. They voted to accept my resignation, a very
right.
different kind of thing from their perspective. Now, it was still a 4-3 vote. There were 3 council members didn't want to accept it. So, but let's talk a little bit about some things, just because we're going to run short on time here once again, but talk about some of the things that you want to make sure that are included. So compensation is one of them. One of the things I recommend is include some mutual non-disparagement language. Don't badmouth them, and maybe they won't badmouth you. And putting that in there puts them on notice. We're not going to talk bad about one another. We're going to try and handle this like reasonable, rational, decent people, and try to be as amicable as possible about it and keep things out of the paper. Now, it may be that those things are not enforceable, but nevertheless, you set the standard out there, and at the very least, managers should abide by it on their end. Do not badmouth the council when you're walking out the door. I think it's a terrible look for that. Sometimes you can include in the separation agreement that the mayor will give you a letter of recommendation. That's always handy if you can get it. You're going to want things like mutual release of claims. So once that relationship is done, you're not going to sue them, they're not going to sue you. One of the other things that you want to make sure to have in there is that they won't contest an unemployment filing. Even in the case where you are voluntarily resigning, if that's under the circumstance where they're kind of forcing a resignation, get in there that, get in a provision that they won't contest an unemployment application if you decide to do it. Then you're going to want some indemnification and hold harmless language so that if you get sued after the fact that the municipality has to represent you. And then the final thing is to think in terms of the fact that they might call you up to come and testify in a lawsuit or testify in an arbitration situation related to anything that you had involvement with during the time that you were employed there. You might want to think in terms of whether they're going to have to compensate you for time that you spend in court or time that you spend giving a deposition or things like that. And so those are all provisions that I think are very valuable to think about as you're thinking about what needs to go in the separation agreement. Let's wrap this up today. Jay, I don't know if you want to talk about what we're going to do next, or if you have lined up a sponsor for this episode.
I have a sponsor here. This is another online organization, Greg, and this sponsor for this episode is Kilometer Supplements of Plateau Heights, Idaho. They are makers of the Worker Bee vitamins. Kilometer Supplements gathers only the finest natural ingredients from wildflowers, grasses, trees, and wild herbs from the plateaus of Idaho. And their mantra is, remember, if bees wouldn't touch it, you shouldn't consume it. So
I don't know why, Jay, why is it this is the second supplement sponsor that you've been able to find?
Well, they're coming out of the woodwork. I think some of them are legitimate, and some of them are, I think, something that's being sold out of the trunk of somebody's car. So you want to be cautious of this. But anyway, so that's our sponsor for this.
All right,
episode,
very good.
Anyway,
Well, look for them wherever your supplements are sold.
Yes, and we've talked. You and I have talked a little bit about where we go from this point. So
Right.
I want to just say the issues of contracts and what we talked about at the front end and now the back end have been some challenging concepts, and so we may take a break before we get into the nuts and bolts of actual contracts, just to let the listeners know that. So
Okay, all right. So look for something maybe a little bit different the next time, and again, don't hesitate to reach out and contact us if you have any thoughts and particularly questions that you would like us to address in a future podcast.
Thank you for listening today. We hope you enjoyed the show. Manager Brothers Lessons Learned is a production of Gregg Guidance, LLC, a multi-specialty consulting firm offering interim management, group process facilitation, workflow analysis, operational studies, and more to local governments in Michigan and beyond.